It's good to see you all here. I'm Jane Vossler, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Community Senior Center. We're really pleased today to have Jack Kelly with us to talk about Valcour, the 1776 campaign that saved the cause of liberty, which is the name of his new book. When was that book published, Jack?
It was last year around April.
Okay, I thought it was pretty new. So Jack is a public scholar, a historian, and a novelist. He is a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellow. He's an award-winning author who's appeared on NPR, PBS, and the History Channel. And he's written for national publications, including the Wall Street Journal and American Heritage. So we're really happy to have you here today, Jack, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jane. I appreciate your setting this up, and I'm very gratified to talk to a group of people that will understand what I'm talking about, because it's happened in your own backyard. This is one of the big Vermont stories of the Revolutionary War. And you can clue me in, Jane, if my microphone or anything goes off. I'm going to try to share with people a PowerPoint, because I think it'll help illustrate some of the points I'm going to make. So I'm going to try to switch over to that now. If I can find it. Well, I guess that's not going to be possible. A little technical glitch there. My book is about the Valcour Island campaign of the summer. There was a big battle at Valcour Island on Lake Champlain, and really the story began in July of 1776. I refer to this as the most important unknown campaign of the Revolutionary War, and I'll explain in a few minutes why I refer to it as that. In the spring of 1776, the patriots were facing a very dire situation. The British had sent over the largest expeditionary force in their history to put down the rebellion in 1 year. And the patriots had just declared themselves independent from England, but they were certainly facing the possibility that the rebellion was going to fail. The target of that army that was sent over by Britain was a corridor that runs down the St. Lawrence River, down the Richelieu River, down Lake Champlain and Lake George, and then with a short break down the Hudson River to New York City. This was the access to the interior of America, and it was the really only route down from Canada. And in particular, it was a backdoor to New England. So if the British were able to get onto the lakes or onto the Hudson River, they could attack eastward into New England, which they saw as really the heart of the rebellion. That summer, the British strategy was to send an army to each end of that corridor. So they sent one army to Canada, and they sent another army to New York City. The Americans also had two armies. One was called the Northern Army, stationed in Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain, and the other was the George Washington's main force down in New York City. The Patriots were very well aware of the strategic significance of that Champlain-Hudson corridor, because they used it the year before to invade Canada. In 1775, they went north along Lake Champlain, they took Montreal, and they made it all the way up to Quebec City. Then the operations stalled. They spent all winter besieging Quebec. And when that army that the British sent over arrived in the spring of 1776, the American effort in Canada collapsed, and they went retreating more than 200 miles back to Fort Ticonderoga where they'd started out. And you don't hear all that much about the Canadian invasion in the history books, I think partly because it was a little embarrassing that the freedom-loving patriots had their first inclination was to invade another province, and also because it was a total disaster. The army that arrived back at Fort Ticonderoga in July of 1776 was utterly broken. They had contracted smallpox while in Canada. So in addition to having retreated and lost most of their morale and their discipline, of the 5,000 men who came back from Canada, 3,000 of them were sick with smallpox and had to be quarantined. But this was the army that had to face the British and stop the invasion that they knew was coming from the north. Now, the fate of the nation in that summer in the north was dependent on three people. Overall command was Philip Schuyler. He was an Albany aristocrat. He had some experience as a staff officer in the French and Indian War, but he was not a battle commander. And he was also quite sickly, and he spent most of his time commanding from his mansion in Albany. His man on the spot at Fort Ticonderoga was Horatio Gates. Gates was an experienced officer. He had spent many years in the British Army, but he, like Schuyler, he was really a staff officer. He was not a battle leader, and he also had a very overblown view of his own abilities. He spent a lot of time trying to imagine how he could replace George Washington as head of the Continental Army. And then the man who would actually face the British in battle was Benedict Arnold. Arnold had absolutely no military experience before the war, and he, of course, 4 years later would betray his country. So it seemed as if this was not the first string of officers to be assigned this very crucial role of stopping the British invasion. But as it turned out, the three men were in many ways ideal for their jobs. General Schuyler was a genius of logistics. He knew how to get the supplies. He'd been a businessman for years. He had very wide contacts among merchants and suppliers, and he knew how to get the supplies that they would need to build a fleet on Lake Champlain. General Gates was a genius of administration. That was his specialty, and he knew how to rebuild an army, how to restore morale, restore discipline, deal with the smallpox, and rebuild the fortifications around Fort Ticonderoga. With the fort itself had fallen into quite a disrepair. And it turned out that Benedict Arnold was a genius of war itself. He had an uncanny knack for strategy and tactics. And as a bonus, he had been a sea captain before the war. So he was familiar with sailing and boats. And it was the type of knowledge that they needed in order to mount a naval campaign on Lake Champlain. So in July in 1776, they began an arms race. The British were building their fleet at St. John's, which is up on the Richelieu River, which is, I'm sure most of you know, flows out of Lake Champlain. They had to build the fleet there because there were rapids on the way down to the St. Lawrence. So they had plenty of ships in the St. Lawrence, but they couldn't sail them up the Richelieu River. The Americans were in a town called Skenesboro at the very southern tip of Lake Champlain. The town is now called Whitehall. And there was an estate there that had a couple of sawmills on it and an iron foundry, and they set up their shipbuilding operation there. What the Americans were looking for, they already had a couple of armed ships on the lake, schooner, about a 50-foot long schooner that they captured from the British, and a couple other smaller sailboats. And they wanted to build gunboats. These were about 50 feet long, and they were really floating cannon platforms. So they had a large cannon in the bow and a cannon on either side. They had a mainsail, but because they were flat bottomed and had no keel, they were very difficult to sail unless the wind was directly from behind. And they were really just oversized rowboats, 50-foot long rowboats. The type of boat that they wanted to build was called a row galley, which could be rowed, but was also a very handy sailing boat. It was about 75 feet long and had heavier guns. These were very difficult to build for amateur carpenters. They really needed skilled shipwrights to build them. But under the direction of Benedict Arnold, the shipbuilding got underway, and they really quite remarkable that within a matter of weeks, they were able to build a small fleet of these various types of boats to confront the British on the lake. And the British were doing the same thing, only much more efficiently with much more skilled shipwrights and a lot of equipment that they brought over, including boats that were sort of prefab boats that they loaded on their ships and could just put together at St. John's. In August, this is beginning in July, so now it's 6 weeks later in the middle of August, Benedict Arnold, who had a very keen sense of the time and how it's important in warfare to take the initiative and get the jump on the enemy, he decided that even though the fleet wasn't complete, he had about 6 gunboats at that point, he would sail up to the north end of Lake Champlain. So he sailed all the way up and into the Richelieu River with this partial fleet. He wanted to get intelligence about what the British were doing. He wanted, in particular, to train his crew. So he would stay up there for weeks, just below the Canadian border, training the crews. Many of them had been drawn from the army. They had been farmers before the war, and they weren't really very experienced at sailing. They had to just learn the basics of sailing. He also wanted his gunboat captains to learn the lake. As I'm sure most of you know, it's very complex terrain in the northern part of Lake Champlain. Many islands, a lot of inlets and coves, and he wanted them to go into those and take soundings and know where they could go, what the conditions were going to be that they were going to be facing up on that end of the lake. And in a matter of a few weeks, he would be moving the fleet down to Valcour Island, but I'll get to that in a minute. Meanwhile, at the other end of that corridor that I mentioned, George Washington was facing a very dire situation himself. The British had landed 40,000 men on Staten Island unopposed. Washington had about 20,000 men in New York City. In August, they fought a major battle on Long Island. The Americans were soundly defeated. In September, the British took over New York City. Washington's army just barely escaped. And by October, they were fighting in White Plains. And in November, Washington had to take his army across the state of New Jersey, across the Delaware River, and into Pennsylvania to avoid being defeated. His 20,000-man army at that point was down to 3,000 men, or 3,000 scarecrows, as he called them. And he wrote to his brother at that time, "I think the game is pretty near up." So that situation around New York City made the campaign in the north all that much more crucial. Benedict Arnold waited, as I mentioned, for all through the month of September. He couldn't quite figure out why it was taking the British so long. He got a couple more gunboats finished, and it was very hard service. These gunboats, 50 feet long, they had a crew of 44 men on them, so they were quite crowded. They had no cabins, they had no berths or hammocks. The men just slept on the deck. They were open boats. They could rig a canopy across the top, but they were pretty much open to the weather. By middle of September, it was getting very cold. The men had come up in August were wearing summer clothes, and didn't have the warm clothes. And they lacked a lot of things, including, in particular, the row galleys, the larger ships, which Arnold kept demanding that General Gates send up, and they could never seem to get them finished. Around the end of September, Benedict Arnold decided to move down to Valcour Island, which is about barely a mile off the New York coast. And he had several reasons for that strategic decision. One was to get closer to Crown Point, which was the forward post of the Americans north of Fort Ticonderoga, so that if he had a run for it, he would have less far to go. There's also a kind of bay behind Valcour Island that would be protected from the storms. There were a lot of storms coming down the lake in the autumn, getting now towards October. And he was also able to hide the fleet in there. If any force coming down the main channel wouldn't be able to see them until they really had gone by them. He was fortunate then that in the first week of October, after he'd moved to Valcour Island, three of the galleys did get finished and they were sent up. So he shifted his flagship over to one of the galleys, and he had now as complete a fleet as that he was going to get. He would have wanted more ships, but that was all they were able to hammer together during this frantic work during the summer. He waited another week, still nothing. Finally, on the morning of October 11th, they had scouting boats out on the lake. They came rushing in and said they sighted sails to the north, and the British were approaching. And they were coming down the lake with a fleet that was much bigger than the Americans had anticipated. They knew they had been building ships all summer. But General Guy Carleton, who was the British commander, had been the governor of Canada, was, like many generals, he wanted more. He wanted more firepower, larger ships. And so he had spent this entire month that Benedict Arnold had been waiting in the north end of Lake Champlain to build a frigate. Now, this was a three-masted, square-rigged, really an ocean-going ship. Nobody had ever seen anything like it on Lake Champlain. It had 18 12-pounder cannon, 9 on each side, almost as much firepower as the entire American fleet. And in addition to that, he had a artillery barge that could both fire on the water and bombard forts on land. He had 22 gunboats compared to the Americans' 8. He had several schooners, armed schooners, and he had an entire 3,000-man advanced force of the British Army waiting on shore with transport boats ready to carry them south as soon as the British fleet had dealt with the Americans. So it seemed like everything was favoring the British that morning. His sailors were skilled Royal Navy sailors. His gunners were very practiced gunners compared to the Americans, who were all pretty much amateurs at their jobs. As they came down the lake, Benedict Arnold had a decision to make, either to retreat, having now seen that it was a much superior fleet that he would be facing, or to stay and fight. his second in command, David Waterbury, insisted that the fleet had to retreat. It would be suicidal to stay in this little cove between Valcour Island and the New York shore with this type of fleet coming towards them. But Arnold had this uncanny intuition, as I mentioned. He could almost read the mind of Guy Carleton. And he assumed that the British wouldn't come down unless the wind was from the north. They wanted the wind at their back as they were sailing down. And that morning, they had a very brisk northerly wind blowing. He also assumed that Carleton, not seeing the American fleet, would assume that they'd retreated and would be in a hurry to catch up to them, which seemed to be the case because Carleton didn't send out any scouting boats himself. He didn't look into the coves or behind the islands. He just came roaring down the lake with the wind at his back, hoping to catch up and demolish the fleet. So Arnold's strategy was to let the British fleet go by, and he then sent out a couple of ships to fire at them from behind. They'd already gone past Valcour Island. At that point, the British, provoked by this firing, had to turn around. Carleton ordered the whole fleet to turn around and sail northward into the wind and then into this rather narrow bay that's between Valcour and the mainland. That was very difficult. In fact, was impossible for the larger British ships. It's very hard, particularly a square rig ship like the frigate that Carleton had built, to sail against the wind. And even the schooners that he had, armed schooners, they had to tack back and forth to go into the wind, and there just wasn't enough room for them to get up into the channel. So Americans had a line of battle then across from Valcour Island to the far side, and the British gunboats, which were like the American gunboats, were basically rowboats, rowed up and formed their own line of battle. And the two sides, with heavy cannon on both sides, from about 3/4 mile apart, began to fire at each other. And there began this cannon duels, probably one of the most brutal forms of warfare, this war at sea during the Age of Sail. There was nowhere to hide. There was no taking cover. The cannonballs, these cannons would fire at supersonic speeds, 12, 24-pound balls, would smash through several inches of oak plank. And all you could really do was hope you didn't get hit. And many men did get hit. It would take off an arm if you were lucky, and do a lot worse if you weren't. And this went on for 7 hours. The noise was tremendous, the chaos of fighting back and forth. The British also had Indian allies that had landed on Valcour Island, were firing with muskets from Valcour Island. Other troops on the shore, New York shore, firing with muskets from there. But they were never able to get their main ships into the battle. And the Americans, they were never able to break the American line. So the Americans were fighting for their lives and were able to hold the line until it got dark and the battle ended. And essentially ended in a draw, which for a small fleet facing the Royal Navy, that was quite an accomplishment. Each side had lost one gunboat. The Philadelphia, the American gunboat, sank just after they got the men off, but it sank just after dark. The Americans had expended 3/4 of their ammunition. Many of their boats were taking on water. They'd been hit so many times by cannonballs, and they knew they would be sitting ducks in the morning. And they seemed to be that the only options were to wait to be slaughtered or to surrender the fleet. Benedict Arnold came up with another option. After it got dark, he ordered the boats to line up in a single file line. They put a chalk mark on the back of each boat so that the boat behind could see them in the dark, and they began to row with muffled oars very quietly right along the New York shore. The time they'd spent learning the lake and learning the terrain in Lake Champlain really paid off, because they were able to go as close as possible without going aground along the shore, whereas the British in the dark, and having not been on the lake before, had to keep off a half, 3/4 of a mile. So the Americans were able to escape during the night and started rowing. The wind shifted around to the south, and they had to row into the wind, but they rowed quite a ways down the lake. And when the British, when it got light in the morning, the British were flabbergasted that this fleet that they trapped in this bay had somehow disappeared, and they spotted them way down the lake. So there began a day of essentially a race down the lake. The British, that lasted all day and all the next night. The British caught up to the American fleet. They had the faster boats, these larger boats, and they caught up with the American fleet around Split Rock area. They captured one of the American galleys and about 110 men on it. Some of the American boats were able to escape down to Fort Ticonderoga, and Benedict Arnold, with his galley and he had 4 gunboats left, took a stand against the British south of Split Rock and fought for 2.5 hours until his ammunition was almost gone. He then pulled into a small bay that was called Ferris Bay, that's on the coast of what's now called Button Bay. It was called Button Mold Bay back then, on the Vermont side. He knew the British ships, the large ships, couldn't go into that bay because it's too shallow. He ordered all of his boats to be grounded and then set a fire, the purpose being to prevent the British from getting hold of them and using them themselves. He kept the flags flying. He would not surrender the fleet. Once the fire reached what was left of the gunpowder, the boats blew up, and he was able to walk down from Ferris Bay down to Crown Point and cross over. It's actually Crown Point's being on the New York side. That Ferris Bay was later renamed Arnold Bay, and it still has that name today. It's one of the few places in America that has a name that's in honor of Benedict Arnold. The British were easily able to take Crown Point, which was very exposed for the fleet. They transported the army down to get ready for the next phase of their campaign. The Americans consolidated all their defenses at Fort Ticonderoga, and they waited. They waited for a week and then another week, and finally, in the 1st of November, they sent scouts up to Crown Point, and they said the British are gone. And General Carleton, as I might have indicated, was a very cautious man. He was very familiar with the weather in Canada. He'd lived in Canada for years, and he was afraid of the lake freezing behind him. If he'd started a siege of Ticonderoga and wasn't able to break the Americans' lines immediately, the lake could freeze, and that would have been a disaster for the British, because that would have cut them off from their supplies and their reinforcements. So he decided he'd achieved enough for that year, and that it was better to go back, spend the winter in Montreal, and then start afresh the next year, which is what happened. Only it wasn't General Carleton who commanded the army that came down the following year, but General Burgoyne. And of course, General Burgoyne ended up with, for him, a disaster at the Battle of Saratoga. So that was the end of that campaign. And the the reason I call this the most important unknown battle of the war, there's really two reasons. The first is that in 1776 was really the best chance, and I think most historians agree now, that was the best chance that the British had to win the war outright. It was certainly their intention to do that. And the fact that they had sent over this massive force and were unable to win in that year was largely because of the army in the north. And the fact that they prevented that, the Battle of Valcour Island, the whole campaign was not what you would call a victory, but it was a delaying tactic, and that was sort of what it was intended to be all along. And it bought time for the Patriots to keep building their army, keep getting supplies, trying to get allies, and to continue the war. And that is a theme in the Revolutionary War in general, is the Patriots were able to hold out, and the British were eventually worn out. The other reason, which is somewhat related to this, was that after the British went back to Canada, General Gates and Benedict Arnold marched 600 men down from Ticonderoga that were no longer needed at Fort Ticonderoga. And they took them down by boat to partway down the Hudson River, then marched all the way around and joined George Washington's army on the far side of the Delaware River. Washington at that point was trying to make a decision, and it's impossible to know what factors he considered, but we can imagine that he knew that the threat from the north had been neutralized. He had 600 additional men for his army, and whatever the reason, he decided to risk his entire army on Christmas night, cross the Delaware, and attack the Hessian soldiers at Trenton, and scored one of the most important victories of his career, both against the Hessians and then a week later against the British in the Battle of Princeton. So that was a huge factor in turning around, restoring American morale, and keeping the war going on Washington's end as well. And the fact is that some of the men who fought at Valcour Island in October also crossed the Delaware with Washington and fought at Trenton. I usually mention, I'm sorry I don't have the images to show you, but the gunboat that sank at Valcour Harbor, the Philadelphia, in 1776, sat on the bottom for 159 years. And in the 1930s, some divers found it and salvaged it. It was brought up and eventually found its way to the Smithsonian Institute. And you can see it down there today. It's the oldest existing American warship. And to me, one of the most poignant relics of the Revolutionary War, because it's not a model and it's not a replica. It's the actual ship and the actual guns that fired at the British. They actually, when they brought it up, the bow cannon was still loaded. And it's the decking of that boat actually absorbed the blood of men who were fighting for independence. So if you ever get a chance down at the Smithsonian, it's a very interesting example of what the type of warfare I've been talking about. And I'll just conclude by saying that there's been some question raised lately about the relevance of the Revolutionary War. And some make the point that the founders had too many flaws to be really regarded today. And certainly, like any historian, I understand the necessity of closely examining the flaws and failings of the founding generation. But I think it's important to keep in mind that that these people put forth an idea, and it's a rather simple idea that no person is superior because of birth. It was a very startling idea at the time when aristocracy and monarchy was really dominated the world. The idea that people had inalienable rights that did not flow from their position or their wealth, but from being simply that they were human beings. So I think it's helpful to focus on the people who fought the war because they were fighting for that idea. And they were mostly common people. Even many of the officers in the American Army were not aristocrats. They were just common people. And 3 months after independence, when the nation was more divided probably than it is now, when no one really knew who was going to win the war, these men were willing to go to a remote northern lake and face cannon fire for an idea. And as they did so, they were thinking about us. There are many references in the letters and diaries of that time to generations unborn that would profit from their sacrifice. So I like to think that maybe in these difficult and divided times that we're going through, that learning about these people and learning about their actions and their courage and perseverance can inspire us to believe that there's still life in that idea. So thank you. That ends my presentation. The book is called Valcour, the 1776 campaign that saved the cause of liberty. It's available at any bookstore or Amazon. And I have a website, jackkellybooks.com, which is, you can get in touch with me if you have any questions. I assume we're going to take questions now. Is that right, Jane?
Yes.
So thank you. Thank you all for tuning in today.
Thank you, Jack. Are there any questions? Kevin? I think you're muted, Kevin.
Okay, I got it. I'm used to a different system. That was an excellent presentation, Jack. You know, that you really put some drama in that. What I'm thinking of is an uncanny resemblance between what you just described and the campaign of the Battle of Lake Champlain in 1814. And one of the most interesting factors is the overall commander on the Canadian side was Guy Carleton. And he had a fleet and he had a force marching down the New York side, a fleet recently built on the lake. And there was a big battle in Cumberland Bay right off of Plattsburgh. I won't get into the details, but Carleton had 15,000 men, 2/3 of whom were fresh from the Napoleonic Wars. And Carleton turned around and left. And that was one of the most significant things that happened during that war.
Yeah, I think I'm not an expert on the War of 1812, but I know about that battle. And the interesting thing was that when they came down during this campaign and Carleton was leading the fleet in 1776, they expected the Americans to meet them in Cumberland Bay. They thought that's a good place to have a battle, which it certainly would have been for them. And when they came to Cumberland Bay and found that Arnold wasn't there waiting for them, I think that's when he really became convinced he had to hurry down the lake and catch up to him. So it was part of the strategy. So the British, one of the interesting things about the British sailors, and they were extremely skillful, but they were used to sailing on the open ocean. There are no lakes in England that are large enough to have a warship on. So none of them had much experience in fighting on a lake. And I think that was the big factor, really, that the fact that there was always the possibility of running into rocks or shallows, or where the Ausable River comes in just below Valcour Island. It's a huge shoal area, very shallow because the sand is deposited there. All these things worked in the Americans' favor because they were familiar with the waters, and the British weren't.
There's a note in the chat from Joss Bessie that says an historic replica was built by the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum of the Philadelphia in Ferrisburg, and it's on display there.
Yes, I would, anybody that has interest in this campaign, definitely try to get down to, in Vergennes, this Lake Champlain Maritime Museum has many of the relics from the battle, and they constructed an exact replica of one of the gunboats, of gunboat Philadelphia. They call it the Philadelphia II, and it really brings it home to be able to see that. It's on the water. It's got the cannon on it. It's you can see how the sail was. You can see how imagine how crowded it was if they had 44 people on it, on a 50-foot boat. So it's definitely worth it. And they sell it, I think, occasionally, but it's usually docked at the museum. And I think they've been back open this year, though it's at least for outside events. So they actually, Lake Champlain Maritime Museum did a survey of all the shipwrecks in Lake Champlain, and they found another gunboat called the Spitfire back in the 90s, and they have been contemplating raising that to save, salvaging that as well. But that was not in Valcour Bay. It sank as they were trying to retreat, and it's about 150 feet of water, so it's a much more difficult proposition to bring it up and salvage it. Normally, they would leave it there since it's lasted for over 2 centuries at the bottom. But it's being attacked by invasive quagga mussels, which will dissolve iron so that eventually will completely disintegrate. So if anybody has $40 million they want to donate, they figure that's the estimated cost of bringing it up and preserving it.
Any other questions?
One thing I would ask if I was asking questions is if this was an important campaign, why is it unknown? And it was a question I really had to wrestle with as I was writing the book, is because I thought it's very interesting. The whole campaign is interesting. Why isn't it more well known? Whereas the battle at Trenton or the battle in New York City are very well known. And I usually refer to a book by David McCullough, who I consider one of our great historians, wonderful writer. And he wrote a book called 1776. And that was about the Revolutionary War during that 1 year, 1776. And in that book, he has not a single mention of the Northern Campaign whatsoever. He doesn't slight it or anything. He just doesn't mention it at all. And so I had to ponder why that was, but I think it was McCullough in particular is a narrative historian. He likes a good story, and the story of George Washington in New York is a fascinating story. He starts out in complete command, gets battered, sort of like the Rocky story, and ends up on the ropes over in Pennsylvania, and then comes off and gets in one knockout punch with the British at Trenton. Very uplifting, very concise story. The Northern Campaign is a little bit more problematic. It's led by a man who eventually became a traitor. And I think that one of the reasons over the 2 centuries in between that it's been slighted is largely Benedict Arnold. He's nobody likes to sing the praises of Benedict Arnold, and it's a lot easier to talk about George Washington. So, any other questions or comments?
It's a quiet group today, Jack.
Quiet, yes. Oh, Carleton's Prize, as somebody mentioned in the chat there. When the British suddenly woke up to the fact the Americans had escaped from the bay at Valcour Island, they were, General Carleton, of course, was outraged. He was an Army guy, so he had to leave a lot of the decisions to the Navy, and I think they were the ones that decided to pull back from the mainland and give the Americans an escape route. And he was outraged, so somebody thought they'd spotted the Americans on the far Vermont side of the main channel, and so they started firing at them until they realized it was an island had a few pine trees on top of it, and sort of in the shape of a ship. And that island, which is over on the just off the Vermont coast, was given the name Carleton's Prize in a very kind of ironic or snarky naming of it, and it still has that name today. So it's an uninhabited. It's really just a rock, but it's still there today.
There's another question in the chat. Charlotte asks, how does one muffle oars?
Well, they had the oars on the gunboats were resting between two pegs in the gunnels of the boat. So they'd stick the pegs in and they'd use those as oarlocks. And they simply wrapped cloth or sailcloth or canvas around where the oar was in that, so it wouldn't rattle back and forth normally. One of the advantages for the Americans was that the noise from all the cannonading all day, 7 hours of cannonading, most of the men on both sides would have been deaf by that point, temporarily deaf, or at least their ears ringing like mad. It was a very, very damaging to the hearing, let's put it that way. And one of the interesting things, I was during the bicentennial in 1976, there were many, many reenactments. And even though they would fire less powerful loads and without even cannonballs behind them, a lot of the reenactors had pretty significant hearing loss because they went to so many reenactments that they weren't quite as knowledgeable about taking precautions as they would be now, and they just they love firing off these cannon, but they're very loud.
Andrew, did you have a question?
Well, yeah, I was just wondering, years ago I read a couple of books by Kenneth Roberts, and he went into some detail about this battle at Valcour, and I was wondering what you thought about his telling of it. I assume a lot of that's fiction because you give the narrative of the people talking to each other, but
well, I was attracted to those books as well. I remember reading them years ago, and I've looked at them again. And Roberts was a very careful researcher, and he actually did a lot of research about those aspects of the Revolutionary War. And the novels, they were novelized in the sense that there would be dialogue, and he would tell what people were thinking and what their intentions were, that weren't really, you couldn't anchor those things in the research. But the general story is very accurate. And I think things have been discovered since those. I believe those books were written in the 40s. But he, for example, he collected all all the diaries of the men who, the year before Valcour, Benedict Arnold had led a campaign over the Maine mountains. And he collected all the diaries of the men who went with him, and it was a very trying, epic journey over the Maine mountains to attack Quebec. And he had a very, very well-researched book about that aspect of the war as well. So yeah,
Arundel, yeah.
Yeah. So he's, I think he's done a great service. I think a lot of times historical fiction really pulls people into the interest in the war more sometimes than just the facts. So I'm all for it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Kevin, you had a question?
It was just exactly the same observation that was made about Kenneth Roberts' books. I'll just say that he liked Benedict Arnold. He cast him in a very favorable light.
Well, it's the Benedict Arnold's reputation has been during the early years, or early centuries, I should say, because really for 2 centuries, he was castigated as the worst traitor going. And of course, his treason was very dramatic and very egregious. But I think in the meantime, people lost sight of all that he accomplished, and he really did accomplish an enormous amount in the first 3 or 4 years that he fought on the part of the Americans. So I think Arnold was a type of person who was a true believer and a fanatical believer. And when he believed in the American cause, he was fanatically for it and very capable. And when he lost faith, he was very fanatical and capable on the other side. So sort of a paradox.
Susan, you had your hand up? Susan Harrett?
Oh, I'm sorry. That's
Oh, it's
sitting next to me. I'm Bill Butler. I was wondering at what point that the land forces engaged around the swamps of Bennington. They must have gotten down there by boats, I would assume. That's an extension of this story. At what point does that fall together with what you're talking about?
Well, one of the, I guess, major consequences of the Valcour campaign in 1776 was the effect that it had on the invasion of the following year in 1777. General Carleton had expected to really do a replay of the sailing down from Canada, but John Burgoyne, who was his subordinate, had gone back to England and convinced the British authorities to put him in charge. And so the next year, because the American fleet had been destroyed, they came down by ship. They took Fort Ticonderoga. They continued down mostly along Lake Champlain to Skenesboro or Whitehall. And then Burgoyne led his troops down, angled over, got to the Hudson River, and started coming down the Hudson River, and they were marching along the shore of the river, and they got as far as what's now Schuylerville in New York State. And that was where the Battle of Saratoga took place. On their way down there, they began to get short of supplies, and they wanted to get more horses. They had some German dragoons that were walking along with them. They would like to get them on horses. And they heard there were a lot of horses and supplies over in Bennington, so they sent largely the German sort of Hessian forces to attack Bennington and take all these supplies and bring them back. And they were met by some very tough militiamen, mostly from New Hampshire under John Stark, and defeated at just outside of Bennington. Actually, the Battle of Bennington actually took place in New York State, but it was just over the border. And that was a big blow to Burgoyne and really sealed his fate that he wasn't able to make it to Albany and ended up being defeated at Saratoga. I always like to tell this story of somebody asked Grandma Moses to do a painting of the Battle of Bennington, and she went and researched, looked up the uniforms, read about the battle, how it took place, and painted a nice painting of the Battle of Bennington. And then somebody pointed out to her the battle monument wasn't there during the battle. And she had that big tower that said Bennington sticking up there. And she was very embarrassed by that. It was actually it was kind of touching, but yeah, it was.
Laura, you have a question.
I wondered if the population was so sparse, probably in the area of Vermont and New York around Plattsburgh and Valcour at the time, whether that had any impact on the fact that people didn't have that much recording of that battle or didn't really recognize its worth or something.
Yeah, I think.
And my second question is whether Benedict Arnold got any snaps for recognition for what he had done.
Yeah, that's for your first question. It's very true that that it was a very remote area back then. It was virtually unsettled, particularly the northern part of Lake Champlain. There were a few people that had started homesteading up there. Very, very, very sparse. It had been subject to Indian attacks for many years, and the people were reluctant to. And there was just sort of a no man's land. There was very little in the way of witnesses, and it was very different than in New York. And I think you're right that one of the reasons it was neglected was it didn't involve the population centers that New York, Long Island, New Jersey already were pretty well populated. So that was very true. As far as Arnold's being rewarded, he'd been promoted to brigadier general from his activities in Canada the year before, and he expected to be named a major general, which was pretty much the highest rank below Washington. And in February, the Congress at that time made all the promotions. Washington really didn't have anything to do with it. Even there was a lot of politics went into it. They promoted 5 men who had served under Arnold to become major generals over him. And he looked at on the list, and Washington too looked on the list of promotions, and his name wasn't there. And I think of any event that you want to point to at the beginning that formed the beginning of his treason, it was that fact that he did not get rewarded for and many agreed, including George Washington. It was a tremendous effort that he'd made in the North and very successful. And Washington was flabbergasted that they didn't get promoted. But it was just a matter of politics. I think Arnold began to lose faith in Congress and in succeeding on from that in the whole cause because of that. And it went on. He was a very prickly guy, and he made enemies very easily, and he had a lot of enemies, and he didn't know how to go to Congress, and he didn't really have time to go down politic in Philadelphia. So his enemies were able to make inroads and prevent him from being rewarded or from being promoted.
Andrew.
Yeah, since you brought up Saratoga, the Battle of Saratoga, I was curious. I had also heard or remember reading from Kenneth Roberts' books that Arnold was considered the hero of Saratoga. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
I think that's very true too. He was a very effective battle leader. He was very effective at inspiring troops, And at Freeman's Farm, but particularly at Venice Heights, which was they call the second Battle of Saratoga, that was the real victory. He rode into the very thickest of the fighting, led the troops, took one of the major British redoubts, had his horse, a bullet go through his leg and then killed his horse. His horse fell on his leg. And that was the end of his fighting career, right? You know, at least for the American side. And he was probably, I would say entirely, but he was largely responsible for the victory there. I think they would have won eventually anyway, but you know, Carleton or Burgoyne's chances were diminishing, but that's what finished him off. So, and there's always been the idea that some people, again, Arnold was slandered for a long time. A lot of stories were made up about him. One of them being he was drunk at Saratoga and he rushed out and would acted like a crazy man. But he was not. That was not true. And the letter eventually, and within the last 10 years, somebody found a letter that clarified some of his activities at Saratoga, and really made him seem more to the battle than they even thought before. So that's, I think Robert said that right too.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you.
Great questions.
Yeah.
Good answers. Thank you very much, Jack. We're really pleased that you were able to come and talk to us.
Okay, well, I appreciate it, Jane, and thank you all. And you know, get out on the lake once you pick up a copy of the book, and it's kind of a guidebook to you can get over to Plattsburgh, and even on the Vermont side, there's plenty of places that were involved with the battle, so you can see it in your own backyard.